Part of becoming a better hunter is not only about learning the monster's moves and weaknesses, but it's also about mastering your weapons so you can utilize them to their full potential. As a hunter that tries to improve their skill, I thought it would be a cool idea to rank every Monster Hunter weapon to find out which ones are the hardest to master. Their rankings will be based on some opinions I've gathered from speaking to a few speedrunners in the community, as well as my own judgment. This does not reflect how powerful a weapon is, or how easy it is to learn how to use it. It's specifically about the weapon's skill ceiling. Just how much do you have to optimize in order to fully master it? As such, some of the easier weapons to pick up and use may turn out to be the hardest to master and vice versa. With that being said, hello hunters, my name is Dark Hero and these are the most difficult weapons to master in Monster Hunter, starting with the Sword and Shield. Despite how beginner friendly the Sword and Shield is, there is a lot more going on with it than it may seem at first. Because you have so many options available at your disposal, optimizing combos can be tricky. Do you go for the infinite sword combo? Maybe a shield bash combo? A mix of the two? Or perhaps perfect rush is better? Besides, due to your very limited reach, you may have some difficulty against larger monsters. On top of it, a great sword and shield user can consistently abuse the iframes on the back hop, as well as perfectly timed Shoryugeki to get the most satisfying counter in the game. Sadly, the Sunbreak additions didn't do much for the Sword and Shield. Destroyer Oil really isn't all that great, but hey, now it restores some sharpness. Shield Bash is a bit situational, but it is a good way to close the gap between you and the monster, potentially KOing it along the way. There's also a decent variety of mixed sets available for you to craft, with elemental as well as raw damage builds being both viable, on top of the fact that just about every skill is useful for this weapon, from offensive guard to razor sharp or even evade extender. Overall, Sword and Shield fits the perfect balance between being a reliable weapon that's easy to pick up and use for just about anyone, but offers a good deal of mechanics that can only be truly mastered by skilled hunters. I miss Chaos Oil and I put Sword and Shield in the medium difficulty for mastering the weapon. Next up we have the Dual Blades. Dual Blades are a fairly straightforward weapon. It's all about getting in close and maintaining DPS uptime. Sadly, the current best way to play Dual Blades is to just spam Spiral Slash, and when the wire bugs are on cooldown, the best move is to play aerial style with Demon Flight, which frankly doesn't have a lot of skill expression. You're basically just pressing circle twice until you can use Spiral Slash again. A lot of the Dual Blades mastery comes from carefully managing your stamina as well as using your dash effectively, so as to not spend wire bugs on Shrouded Vault and use them instead on Spiral Slash, as well as using your dash offensively, dealing some damage thanks to Feral Demon mode, though many hunters prefer to use the regular demon mode as it is faster. Slide Slash combo is actually a pretty good switch skill, providing even more mobility while dishing out decent damage, and Iron Shine Silk is a pretty good quality of life addition, as otherwise you'll be burning through your sharpness. If used correctly, you may even free up some decoration slots that you would normally use for razor sharp or protective polish. So I would say that Dual Blades got some really good additions with Sunbreak. Overall, I have to say that Dual Blades are one of the least difficult weapons to master, so that's where I am putting them on the list. And now it's time for the iconic Greatsword. Now typically I would consider Greatsword a pretty difficult weapon to master. Having such a slow moving weapon that requires a lot of build-up and commitment to maximize its damage, as well as having to predict the monster's movements so you can head snipe them with a true charge slash and be as effective as possible. That is the traditional Greatsword playstyle that only a truly skilled hunter would be capable of mastering. However, in Sunbreak, that playstyle has changed a lot, morphing into something that's almost unrecognizable. Strong Arm Stance, aka the new counter that Greatsword received in Sunbreak, has become the weapon's focal point, as the counter stance not only remains active for quite a long time, but using it after initiating a charge slash will immediately lead to a true charge slash, which is by far Greatsword's highest damaging attack, allowing you to dish out tons of damage. Additionally, activating Strong Arm Stance will trigger the skill Offensive Guard, provided that it is equipped, which will further boost your attack by 15%, making this weapon far more deadlier. The counter TCS alone has put Greatsword far ahead of every other weapon when it comes to straight up damage, and the speedrun records show it. There's even this neat little trick that you can do where you place a small barrel bomb and counter its explosion just so you can have an offensive guard boosted TCS, in case the monster is down and you want to maximize your damage. Of course, the downside of this playstyle is that it requires you to consume 2 wire bugs whenever you use Strong Arm Stance. That being said, this can easily be remedied by equipping the skill Wirebug Whisperer, increasing your Wirebug recovery speed to the point where you can do 2 counter TCSs back to back by cancelling the end-lag animation of one of your TCSs through the use of switch skill swapping. And all of this is, well, quite easy. Yes, it does take some time to understand a monster's moves, so you're able to react on time, and the Greatsword is still the slowest weapon in the game. But given how forgiving the timing of the Greatsword counter is, I can't really say that the Greatsword is all that difficult to optimize and master in Sunbreak specifically. Apart from counter TCS, mastering the tackle is also key to being an effective Greatsword hunter, as well as making sure that the power sheath buff is active for as long as possible, as it represents a significant increase in damage. Sadly, the rest of Sunbreak's additions are nowhere near as powerful as Strong Arm Stance, with Backslash feeling lackluster in comparison to Power Sheath, and Surge Slash combo being a fast multi-hit combo that can be performed in many different ways to best fit the situation, that someone fills a niche that Greatsword didn't have before. Again, Greatsword is by no means an easy weapon to use, despite how simple it may be. I simply believe that, in Sunbreak, it's one of the least difficult weapons to optimize and master, which is why I put it here on the list. Next up is the Longsword, and I might actually get some hate for this, but despite Longsword being one of the easiest weapons to pick up and use, especially in Monster Hunter Rise and Sunbreak, where it seems the devs have done as much as they could to lower the weapon's skill floor, even giving Longsword an automatic counter, I believe it's also one of the hardest weapons to master in the game. Now, before you start disliking the video, hear me out. The difference between a casual longsword hunter and one that's actually mastered the weapon is crazy. There is an enormous gap between the two, largely attributed to nailing the timings of the weapon, knowing which counter to use in which situation, and also because of the newly introduced Silkbind attack, Harvest Moon. You have to be careful about placing it in a good spot, because otherwise you're only going to hurt yourself, as you won't be able to go even near the monster. And of course, not having to rely on Sakura Slash or Serene Pose counter means that you'll have those wire bugs available to use on more offensive moves. One other thing that I'm not too sure should be included as a factor is that it seems like the longsword is a weapon that, for some reason, just has a lot of bugs, and a lot of times you simply will deal no damage even after you perform a perfectly timed special sheath counter move. We've all seen those clips on Twitter and YouTube, and well, it's just annoying to deal with that. The argument could be made that there's a bit less skill involved with the longsword, as you don't really need to practice any complex combos, so much as you have to rely on your reactions to perfectly time the counters. That being said, I believe that mastering the longsword does take a lot of practice and skill, and as such, in my opinion, it belongs at the very least to the medium difficulty when it comes to mastering a weapon. I was thinking of placing it higher on the list, but after talking to some speedrunners, I think that this is a good spot to leave it at. Next up is the Lance. Lance is a very simple weapon, but much like Greatsword, it takes a skilled hunter to truly master it. While it is very easy to pick up and use the Lance for the first time, Simply relying on poking the monster and hiding behind the shield, optimizing lance is all about being precise. Constantly and relentlessly hitting the monster's weak spots, as well as counter monster's attacks with insta-block, followed by cross-sweep for some great damage as it can be boosted by offensive guard. Nailing the timing on this can be quite difficult. From my personal experience, I've had more trouble nailing insta-block consistently than any counter in the game. However, if like me you're not so good at using insta-block, you can always rely on the guard dash leaping thrust followed by a charged wide slash playstyle that could be considered, for lack of better words, somewhat brain dead, though you'll be missing out on a lot of DPS that way. It's also key to maintain the Anchor Rage buff, which boosts your attack depending on the potency of the attack you have countered. You could rely on this Silkbind attack for defending yourself against big monster attacks, but it would be an inefficient use of your wire bugs, so once again, insta-block is the preferred way to go about blocking and countering with the lance. You can use your wire bugs instead on offensive moves like the newly added Skyward Thrust, which does pretty good damage, but can be quite hard to hit at the right angle to deal as much damage as possible. Or Spiral Thrust, which can be used as a counter that also deals some damage on top of granting a temporary attack buff if performed after a successful counter. Sheathing Retreat is more of a repositioning tool that puts quite the distance between you and the monster, usually used as a way to quickly dodge a big AoE attack, especially if it's an unblockable attack, and get back into the fray just as fast. I'm somewhat conflicted on how I would rate the lance here. On one hand, it is a very straightforward weapon. However, on the other hand, it's a weapon that doesn't really have a perfect plan for every hunt. You more so go with the situation, insta-blocking the attacks that come your way, and aiming for the weak spots as much as you can. You don't really have a button combination that will instantly result in a ton of damage, like for example Sunbreak's greatsword with its counter. And again, this video is all about mastering and optimizing a weapon, and there's so much that can go wrong with the lance, like misinputting a direction, causing you to make a weak spot, or slightly missing the insta-block timing, and that's where I think the deceptive difficulty of mastering the lance comes from. As such, I'm putting lance as one of the hardest weapons to master, although I can understand why some would choose to place it in a different tier. After the lance, we of course have the Gunlance. There are a lot of intricacies to this weapon. Firstly, even at a more surface level, you have 3 different shelling types, which offer 3 different playstyles. Normal shelling for the full burst playstyle, long shelling for poke shell poke, and wide shelling for charged shells. So with that, there are a few different combos that you can perform, but I would say the hardest part of the Gunlance is all the upkeep and things you need to keep track of, on top of how inconsistent or how difficult it can be to consistently land all of your moves. We're talking about applying and maintaining the Hail Cutter buff, using Ground Splitter iframes to power through monster attacks while buffing the damage of your shells, abusing the fact that Wyvern Fire can now block attacks, using Blast Dash and Reverse Blast for mobility while also dealing a good chunk of damage, and also being careful enough not to get hit by any incoming attacks, and Bullet Barrage to unload a crap ton of damage. Of course, there are some playstyles that can be a bit simpler, and you don't really need to think about what you're doing as much, like for example, an Infinite Burst Fire combo. But when it comes to mastering a weapon, there is a lot that goes into the Gunlance, to the point where new tech is constantly being found. Sadly, Gunlance still has many drawbacks, but that only makes me respect Gunlance mains even more. I think it's fair to say that Gunlance is one of the hardest weapons to master in the game, so that is where I'm putting it on the list. Next on the list is the Switch Axe. Now, Switch Axe is a weapon that can be somewhat difficult to pick up and use for the first time. Learning how to use the 2 forms can be tricky, on top of having to manage your gauge as well as the amped state, It can be a lot for a newer player to take in. However, once you get comfortable with the weapon, there's not a whole lot to optimize here, which may sound surprising to some. If you really want to do as much damage as possible, you'll be relying on the classic sword axe combo a lot, with a bit of 2-stage morphed slash combo on the side to restore some switch gauge, while also using the newly added elemental burst counter, which not only puts you into amped state immediately, but it also deals a ton of damage. And every now and again, take the opportunity to perform a zero-sum discharge and follow it up with a Soaring Wyvern dive for an awesome combo and a great deal of damage. A lot of it comes down to knowing the hunt well enough to the point where you know what the monster is going to do, and so you're able to respond accordingly. It is imperative that you master the timing on the counter, but as you can see from the gameplay in the background, you really don't need much else besides this. Of course, you need to be careful about proper positioning too, as without a Vade Extender, the small hops while wielding the switch axe can end up with you getting hit or even carting. In addition to having a rather simple way of optimizing the weapon, switch axe is also incredibly strong, being the strongest melee weapon in the game, second only to greatsword. As such, I'm a bit torn between putting switch axe as a medium difficulty to master weapon or as one of the least difficult to master, but for now I'm going to put it in medium. And of course, following the switch axe we have the charge blade. Charge blade is a bit interesting because I feel like, for a new hunter, learning the charge blade isn't all that easy. There's too many things to keep track of. Files, sword mode, axe mode, powering the shield, powering the sword, counters, guard points, and you even have the two wildly different playstyles between the SAED spam or spinning axe playstyle. However, once you get over the basics, it can be easy to perform well with the weapon as it offers a lot of coverage options. You essentially have a tool for every situation, but when we're talking about optimizing the charge blade, things get a bit more complicated once again. While the SAED spam playstyle is very easy to execute, you need to make sure that you land as many files as possible, and that can be extremely tricky as slightly tilting the analog stick can sometimes result in you missing too many file explosions, which would mean a big DPS loss, not to mention that even though Sunbreak has improved the consistency of the files, there's going to be unfortunate instances where the game simply won't register them all correctly, and that's just something that you'll have to deal with. It is also ideal that you use the SAED after a guard point, as it'll be much stronger thanks to offensive guard boosting its damage. In addition, you don't want to rely too much on counter peak performance just to counter and follow it up with an SAED. It would be much preferable to use the wirebugs more efficiently to recharge your files and power up your sword and shield. That way, you don't even need to spend time attacking the monster to recharge the files and can just focus on unleashing SAEDs. A lot of it is knowing the hunt, how the monster behaves, and when not to immediately follow up with an SAED, as sometimes the window you have is too small for it to connect. It's a rather systematic playstyle, but you still need to pay attention to what you're doing. As for the spinning axe playstyle, in my opinion, this one is just a bit harder to execute, but maybe I'm saying this because I've had way more experience with the former throughout the years. Spinning axe got a fantastic buff in Sunbreak in pretty much every way. Ready stance is a huge addition for this playstyle, as it allows you to chain attacks even without blocking, which means that you can keep on spamming the spinning axe essentially as much as you want, as you can keep regenerating files while you do this by holding the A or circle button on the controller. The problem with this playstyle, however, and what's most difficult about it, is that you can't really sheath the weapon or swap forms, as that will put you out of spinning axe mode, even when you swap back to axe form, so you need to be very careful about not getting hit or losing HP. Thankfully, ready stance can also be used to block even while in spinning axe mode, so it really has become the perfect tool for this playstyle. Though of course, When it comes to optimizing, it would be ideal to not have to block at all and only use the wire bugs strictly to animation cancel with ready stance, or use counter peak performance to power up the shield and spinning axe at the start of the hunt. File follow-up firing pin is yet another great tool for the charge blade that was added in Sunbreak, as it essentially creates clumps of energy on the monster that can be detonated in axe mode for some crazy extra damage. Air Dash is a bit of a flashy silkbind attack, also added in Sunbreak, that works extremely well with spinning axe, as you'll be doing multiple hits through the air, while also triggering explosions created by firing pin. Although this move is a bit more niche, it wraps up the Charge Blade package in Sunbreak quite nicely. Overall, I would classify Charge Blade as a difficult weapon to master because of the combination of the two playstyles, but if I were to rate them independently, I would put mastering the SAD spam playstyle at a medium difficulty and spinning axe playstyle at a hard difficulty. But I could also see why some would argue that it would be lower. Before we continue to the next weapon, if you guys are enjoying this video, then please subscribe. These videos take a ton of time to make, especially this one, and if you are enjoying this, then I'm sure you're going to like the other videos I've made in the past, as well as the bangers that I have coming up in the future. Thank you guys so much for all the support, and let's move on with the video. Next on the list is the hammer. This weapon is all about powering through monsters' attacks, all the while charging up your hammer. Since a lot of the moves are armored, the identity of the weapon and how to optimize it is pretty straightforward. You use Water Strike to counter any attacks, and abuse the iframes when you swap charge modes. Impact Burst, one of the new Silkbind attacks from Sunbreak, is a great addition as it not only does a surprising amount of damage, but it also buffs the hammer, creating shockwaves whenever you hit the monster, which will, of course, do some extra damage, but will also make it easier for monsters to flinch. Spinning Bludgeon Charge does a ton of damage, though you need to charge it, but thanks to the new Silkbind keeping sway, you can reposition yourself while keeping your charge level, therefore making landing those big meaty hits a lot easier. After the latest patch, Dash Breaker not only does increase damage, but it also now preserves max charge if you charge before the end of the move, giving way to more damage potential. Spinning Bludgeon has also been buffed, having its damage increased, but I believe that the optimal way to play Hammer will remain to charge and land those big hits, relentlessly attacking the monster's head and KOing it, and since it is so straightforward, I really don't think there's too much difficulty to mastering the Hammer. And in fact, it may be one of the easiest weapons to master, so that is where I'll be placing it on the list, at least for now. Following the hammer is of course the hunting horn. Hunting horn is one of those weapons that a lot of people seem to think it's hard to use, but it's been made a whole lot easier now in Rise and in Sunbreak. You can get all of your buffs, all of which are listed on screen, without having to play a recital, so you can focus a lot more on just being aggressive with this weapon. And boy, is the hunting horn a good weapon to do that. Of course, when we're talking about mastering the hunting horn, it's important to know the various different combo paths and how to integrate the different melodies in them. Especially if, say, you're running a Berserk or Dereliction set where you have to constantly be playing Health Recovery. That being said, your plan with the hunting horn is, much like with the hammer, to knock down the monster and keep it stun locked for as long as possible. The newly added Silkbind Shockwave, again much like with the hammer, buffs the hunting horn, adding shockwaves to your moves whenever you hit the monster, which will of course do some extra damage, but will also make it easier for monsters to flinch. You've got a big powerful move in Earth Shaker, but it can be dangerous to use as it leaves you open to attacks for a while. But in my opinion, Earth Shaker gets greatly overshadowed by Sonic Bloom. While it may not be all that intuitive at first, Sonic Bloom can deal a ton of damage. It works similarly to Beat of Resonance, but Instead of emitting shockwaves that deal small amounts of damage as you attack, Sonic Bloom also leaves an egg on the ground that, after playing melodies, will deal an insane amount of damage. It's one of the best wake-up moves you have in the entire game, so be sure to abuse that as much as you can. As you can see from the gameplay in the background, it's rather simple. You use Silkbind Shockwave for the extra shockwave hits, buff yourself up with all the melodies, if possible place down Sonic Bloom, and then just keep spamming Heavy Swing into chord with Melody Mode Echo, so that's the A button or circle button followed by the right trigger. You add some Infernal Melody as well as Magnificent Trio whenever it's available, and that's about it. You've got some other useful moves like Slight Beat for example, which can be used as a gap closer, does pretty decent damage and is armored, but if you play your cards right, you may not even need it. I love Hunting Horn, I've always loved this weapon, it's always been one of my favorites. But I have to admit that it really isn't as difficult as some of the other weapons to optimize and therefore master. And for those reasons, that's where I'm putting it on the list. Next is the Insect Glaive, the last of the melee weapons. Insect Glaive is a very fun weapon that's got a lot of things to learn and optimize. It can be complicated for a new hunter, but once you understand the basics, such as managing your Kinsect and your buffs, Insect Glaive becomes rather intuitive. You want to send your Kinsect towards the monster and use Advancing Round Slash to get started on the hunts, as if you are attacked during the spin, you will use that force to jump up, allowing you to follow that up with the Silkbind attack Kinsect Slash, and if that connects, you'll perform a vaulting dance, absorbing the extract, which means you won't even have to spend time aiming at the monsters to get the extracts. However, absorbing the red extract won't allow you to absorb any other extract, so you really want to leave that for last, but at least you'll be able to perform an enhanced Insect Spiker as a trade-off. While on the ground, you should be using Tetraseal Slash, a multi-hit combo that deals a lot of damage and works really well with elemental damage, which of course is what you should be running on the Insect Glaive always. Diving Wyvern is of course the big finishing move that drops you down from the skies and pierces the monster doing a crazy amount of damage. But because its damage is somewhat inconsistent, by that I mean that it is hard to land as many hits as possible with this move, I would argue that against the majority of monsters, if you want to be as efficient as possible, you're better off not using it and keep on using Kinsect Slash. For the different Kinsect types, you really want to use Assist Kinsect for the extra damage. It really adds up over the course of the entire hunt. Awaken Kinsect Attack is a really big powerful move that unfortunately isn't as good as it should be in my opinion, as using it leaves you without any of the extracts. It is supposed to be a big finisher move that you use once the buffs are about to expire. But because it can be somewhat difficult to land this move, and again because it doesn't deal as much damage as I think it should for the cost of this move, even after Awaken Kinsect Attack was buffed in the last patch, I really recommend against using this one. And as for the Dust Spores, I really don't recommend using them. They were really good in the Sunbreak demo, you saw lots of people gathering in groups of 4 and taking down monsters very quickly. But because the HP pool of the monsters has increased so much, the dust explosions are just going to tickle the monsters by this point in the game. As for the rating of the Insect Glaive, I would say that given that it has very simple combos that are easy to execute, it shouldn't be too high in terms of difficulty to master. That being said, managing the Kinsect as well as having to aim sometimes does raise its difficulty to master a little bit, and again the added difficulty of using Kinsect Slash and making sure that you get the red buff last, so that you get all of the extracts and don't even have to aim the weapon, are things that may take some time to master, which is why at the end of the day I think I'm going to place Insect Glaive as a medium tier difficulty to master. Next we have the ranged weapons, starting with the bow. Now, all three of these weapons are incredibly effective at dealing a great amount of damage consistently throughout the hunt. And in the case of the bow specifically, Despite all the nerfs it received in Sunbreak, it remains one of the strongest weapons in the game. Now, your playstyle with the bow is going to focus mostly on using power shots and getting close to the monster, but not too close, just about the perfect distance so that you can maintain critical distance, which will allow you to deal even more damage. In order to help you with this, we do have a new Silkbind attack which was introduced in the Sunbreak expansion, which is called Bolt Boost, which now gives you a super critical range that allows you to then deal even more damage by shooting at that perfect distance. Pair that with Dodge Bolt and you can keep on spamming those power shots and you're going to deal an insane amount of damage. You can also combine that with Stake Thrust, another new Silkbind attack that we got in Sunbreak, that essentially thrusts an explosive stake on the monster, and attacking that stake is going to deal, again, even more damage. There's also the Silkbind Herculean Draw, which you can use to temporarily increase your attack. If you've got a good enough opening, the monster will not even be able to stand up throughout the entirety of the hunt. You'll keep them knocked down and utterly destroy them. That being said, the bow isn't nearly as simple as this. There are a few things that you need to keep in mind. Again, maintaining that critical distance and now the super critical range is key to maximizing your damage. You also want to use your Dodge Bolt not only as a way to deal more damage but also to evade incoming attacks. Perfectly timing this move will allow you to essentially not lose any damage throughout the hunt, and with the crazy damage numbers that we get from the bow, every hit counts. There's also some other playstyles that you can use, such as using aerial aim, which is a good tool to deal good damage, but it looks like it isn't as powerful and isn't currently being used by a lot of speedrunners. Of course, with the bow it is important to know what kind of bow you're using, what kind of shot type it uses, so that you best optimize the build around it. But if you're too concerned about managing any sort of coatings with the bow, when it comes to really optimizing and maximizing your damage output, frankly, you don't need to worry too much about it since you're mostly going to use power coatings. So you should go on a hunt with the recipe to craft power coatings already slotted into your radial menu so that you can quickly access it without wasting any time and keep on dealing as much damage as possible. All in all, I would say that the bow isn't necessarily a weapon that is too easy to master, although it doesn't really have a lot going on. The combos themselves are again quite easy to execute, but it's just about doing the little things at the right time and being consistent with your aim and maintaining that super critical range. For those reasons, I think I'm going to put bow as a medium tier difficulty weapon to master, but I can also see some people putting this lower in the list. Next up is the light bowgun. And frankly, when it comes to optimizing the light bowgun, there isn't a lot that goes into it. And frankly, it might even be easier than the bow. The best way to go about light bowguns is essentially to maintain the critical distance between you and the monster. You can use the new switch skill Critical Firepower, which narrows down the critical distance range and increases the recoil, but in exchange, some shots can deal more damage than usual, which is a nice buff if you're able to maintain that distance as much as possible. And then you just spam your rapid fire bowgun, which will deal a ton of damage, and whenever there is a roar or the monster is about to attack you, you use the newly added Silkbind attack Wyvern counter, which, as the name indicates, it's a pretty straightforward counter where you deal a pretty decent damage against the monster, which does seem to result in a lot of KOs. And again, you maintain that distance, keep on using your rapid fire bowgun. Make sure that you have rapid fire ammo ready to craft and signed in your radial menu so that you have easy access and can keep on spamming that same ammo type. The cool thing about Wyvern counter is that, in combination with Hellfire Blight, whenever you use Wyvern counter you're always going to drop that purple fire beneath you that is just going to rack up even more damage against the monster. You have some other tools available at your disposal with the light bowgun. For example, Max Silkbind Shot is one of the newly added Silkbind attacks in Sunbreak, where it basically turns your light bowgun into a machine gun, which is a lot of fun to use and it looks really flashy, but to be honest isn't all that powerful. But having taken on all of this, and given that the light bowgun is such a fast weapon that is very easy to handle, and given how easy it is to optimize in an actual hunt, and again, The ranged weapons, all three of them, are the strongest weapons in the game. They deal an insane amount of damage. I really think that I'm going to put this in the easy tier. And while I'm at it, I think I'm actually also going to put bow in the easy tier as weapons to master. I think that compared to all the other weapons, I think that would be a lot more fair. And I would also take the opportunity to bump up the greatsword to medium difficulty when it comes to mastering, because I think it would be disingenuous to say that it is of the same difficulty to master as these other weapons. And of course, finally we have the heavy bowgun. Now, truth be told, there aren't a lot of differences between the light bowgun and heavy bowgun in Sunbreak. The biggest difference, I guess, would be that you're slower with the heavy bowgun, and that instead of using rapid fire ammo, you instead use piercing ammo. However, the result is pretty much the same. You'll be dealing a shit ton of damage against the monsters. And Sunbreak, despite all the nerfs heavy bowgun has received in the expansion, with all the added Silkmine attacks, has actually gotten even more powerful. And of course, the Silkmine attack I'm mostly referring to is called Setting Sun, where you let your wire bug create a ring that increases the number of hits per ammo fired through it. So, as I stated earlier, you essentially want to use piercing ammo with the heavy bowgun, and when you combine this with Setting Sun, well, it just results in a ton of damage. Of course, as with all ranged weapons, you want to keep the critical distance between you and the monster to ensure that you deal as much damage as possible. And then there's the added complexity of having Setting Sun and making sure that every shot that you fire goes through it so that you maximize your damage output. And whenever the monster is going to hit you, you can also use one of the two different counters that the heavy bowgun has, those being Counter Charger as well as Counter Shot. Primarily, you would want to use Counter Charger, as Counter Shot not only has a very long animation, but it also doesn't deal nearly as much damage as you would deal by just being there standing and just firing your weapon. One other new Silkmine attack that the heavy bowgun got in Sunbreak is Rising Moon, which also uses the wire bug to create this circular area that basically allows you to extend the range of some of your ammo that passes through it. But when you compare this to Setting Sun, it really pales in comparison, and sure, you can use both, having one of them equipped on each loadout, and then you just put the two rings on top of each other and shoot from there, but it honestly feels like a waste of time when you have so much damage available to you by just using Setting Sun. Also, a newly added switch skill in Sunbreak is Crouching Shot, where of course the hunter crouches and stays in place. However, this allows you to fire rapid successive shots with lower recoil. You can compare this to essentially what was Siege Mode in the past. Now frankly, this move is, or at least was, very weak. That being said, in the latest title update, Crouching Shot was buffed so that it actually feels a lot more like a rapid fire machine gun. So I'm not too sure about exactly the power level of this switch skill. It might actually be beneficial to use this in combination with Setting Sun. I'm not too sure myself. Personally, I'm not friends with any heavy bowgun speedrunners, but if you yourself watching this video are a bowgun speedrunner or a bowgun main, then let me know in the comment section below if Crouching Shot is really all that much more powerful now. That being said, again, the complexity of the heavy bowgun really isn't all that much, and you have the added benefit of being able to also add a block to your weapon, which makes it even easier to use. But of course, if you want to optimize it, you don't want to waste any unnecessary damage, and you really want to max that out, so having to spend any sort of skills in guard, for example, would be a waste. Not that you would need that or anything, because once you start dealing damage against the monster, you're going to trap them and they're never going to get back up. So overall, I think that I would rate the heavy bowgun again as one of the easy tier difficulty weapons when it comes to mastering them. In previous titles, I feel like ranged weapons took a lot more skill to master than this time around, but that is also the trend with Sunbreak for a lot of other weapons, like for example the Greatsword or the Hunting Horn. But those were my thoughts on all the weapons in Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. Remember that these ratings are based on how difficult it is to deal as much damage as possible with every single weapon, and not how easy or difficult it is to pick up and use each of these weapons. I've actually made a video on that in the past, so in case you want to pick up a different weapon and learn it for the first time, or you want to show it to a friend that's new to Monster Hunter or is just getting into different weapons, this would be a good guide to get them started. Subscribe if you're new to the channel for some awesome content. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, happy hunting!